Reform and Religion, Islam and Buddhism within Modern Indian Intellectual Histories. And second up is Dr. Amit Suman, who is a junior fellow here at Teen Murthy, and he will be speaking on the topic of internalizing colonial knowledge, indigenous traditions, and 19th century modern intellectuals. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Dodson, the chair here, and to the organizers of the conference, and to all of you. So the study of religion, and particularly comparative religion, I think poses many areas of reconsideration within recent paradigms of intellectual history. Within the terms set by the conference organizers, I'll argue here or suggest that comparative religion in the late 19th century in India must not be seen as only mimicry of scholars elsewhere, but part of longer traditions of thinking in universal and comparative terms about religion, built out of sources from India. And to further our understanding of religion in the 19th century, I would propose that we think about some of the interventions that have been made in recent years, including those of Professor Dodson, who was the chair of this panel, whose earlier work had focused on histories of the, quote, knowledgeable, and in particular pundits who adapted to changing circumstances in the 19th century, and Brian Hatcher, who has written about these issues as well, about the publications on the life and the thought of Bideshagor, the Pandit and social reformer, who maintained a serious engagement with Sanskrit tradition in order to make arguments that referred to the social world of the 19th century. So too, the project of comparative religion in the 19th century, the subject of my paper today, draws from a range of traditions and is not simply a matter of indoctrination by various forces, whether missionaries, European Orientalists, or those from Theosophy, but out of layers of engagement with finding solutions to problems facing India at the time. So I will today enter into a very brief discussion of recent historiography of cognate fields like the history of science, the history of race, the history of linguistics and Indian history. Also, then I'll introduce the Brahmo Samaj, the site of my investigation of the notion of comparative religion as it developed primarily in the 1880s. And then third, I'll discuss the ways that Islam and Buddhism featured in this project, and end with a few comments about the conference theme, suggesting that comparative religion of the Brahmo Samaj moment of the 1880s deserves study within an Indian intellectual history, and not only, as has been remarked, through the lens of nationalism or modernization. So, within recent intellectual histories of the 19th and 20th centuries in India, a common thread has emerged, notably that the various subfields of intellection, science, race, linguistics, they become comprehensible only in line with other various fields of knowledge. So the study of linguistics, for example, was impossible without the various developments in the study of race. The study of science was likewise animated by a taxonomic impulse that emanated out of various cognates as well. Finding a true or isolable variant of race, language, and scientific knowledge became a key endeavor throughout the 19th century. Finding a true, or for religion, a universal religion, also animated the work of Indian scholars of religion from the 1800s through the mid of the 20th century, before and outside any direct European encounter. To cite one work on the history of science, the work of Projit Mukherjee in his study of Ayurveda, a concept of braided histories emerged to explain how small technologies in a nested layer of causes, amongst other causes like the rise of a public sphere and the rise of nationalisms, explains the modernity of Ayurveda amongst various groups in India, in particular a strand of the Bhadralok of Bengal in the late 19th century, such that there are forms of knowledge that cannot be easily separated from one another, until, of course, the creation of the modern state of India in the 20th century. In my view, these methodological directions link to a conception of religion like the study of linguistics in a recent work by Javed Majid, as a, quote, project with many different strands and narratives, some of which were in tension with each other. And this is the starting point for a discussion of how to think about comparative religion in the late 19th century in India. So on to the Brahmo Samaj, a reformist organization begun in Calcutta in the 1820s. It holds multiple histories and starting points. And for the purposes of this discussion, though I'll have to omit many twists and many turns, one may begin with Ram Mohan Roy, who was mentioned in numerous ways in the first panel. The turn of the century polymath and scholar, and the work of his began before this society emerged. And as I will suggest that the comparative religion moment of the 1880s finds an origin point in the 1800s before the creation of this organization itself. So about Roy, who grew up in post-Plassey Company Bengal of the 1780s and 1790s, studied a variety of subjects, including law, and inherited his father's estate in 1796. He entered money lending, a signature occupation of many rising groups in Calcutta of that moment, real estate, as also work in the service of the East India Company. As was mentioned earlier, he's proficient in Persian. He had working skills in Arabic and Sanskrit, as well as the vernacularizing Bengali. He left the comfortable confines of colonial Calcutta and traveled throughout the Himalayas as well as the Northeast during this time, reaching areas as far as Bhutan and Tibet, and from the opening of the 19th century began to write and translate a long range of works about Indian religion. In line with the broader focus on monotheism throughout the world of this time, late 18th, early 19th century, and true religion, he enters, in a way, the record through a work that is published in the early 19th century, Tuhfatul Mahuddin, a small book written in Persian with an Arabic preface, translated usually as, quote, a present to the believers in one God, frequently glossed as a gift to the monotheists. Its early incarnation circulated in the Persianate and quickly vernacular Bengali world in colonial Calcutta, in English to Anglophone readers in Great Britain and North America. In Britain, where Roy spent the last 2 years of his life, hosted and appreciated by a range of Unitarians and others, where he died in 1833 and is now buried in Arnesvale in Bristol. In this work, he explains how he has traveled to the remotest parts of the world, which for him, of course, means the various borders and boundaries of India and South Asia more broadly. And he concluded that a broad swath of people all agree through his work on the existence of one being as the source of all existence. And in this opening of this book, he explains how he puts aside habits trained by socialization, aside in search of a greater transcendental truth, citing that, quote, it is not the numbers of people behind or against truth that makes it true. There is one constant element, which is the belief in one almighty God, the fundamental principle of every religion. He also talks about other issues of interest at that time, like miracles and birth without parents. He rejects the possibility of either. He also engages in discussions of history and denials of history when encountering resistance to conversion, which was raised by plenty at the time, as he recounted episodes of conversion and change in the Indian religious landscape and Indian religious history. So in which kind of history can this be placed? Like in the European case, when comparative religion entered a vocabulary from the 17th century, such as texts by Turner, William Turner, and then in the early 18th century by Picard, the broader world of Muslim India is one kind of context in which this text emerges. Of course, the Aini Akbari, which has a focus on monotheism in a comparative context, and the Dabistan Majahib, a Persian text written in the 1640s, which compared and assessed the religions of the world from a Zoroastrian framework, was something that we know that he read, as well as the varieties of thought emanating from the critical Vaishnava world. One Baladev Vidyabhushan, active in the 18th century, who worked in the middle of that century with Jaisingh II, and then aimed to bring different strands of Vaishnava thought into Bengal. This appeared to inform many of those people that Ram Mohan worked with in the middle of his life. Through Baladev, there is a normative ideal that is created with reference to the Brahma Sutras, and this is something that Ram Mohan Roy writes about quite a bit in the 1810s and 20s, and it appears later in his thought on his commentaries on particular Upanishads, some of which were mentioned in the first panel. So there are a whole variety of parameters for this opening, for universalisms and comparisons as precedents for the Tufat, which serve as the origin point of debate and discussion about the meanings and ends of comparative religion in India. Much of the work of Ram Mohan Roy in this early moment was about uncovering the primary sources of Indian religion that led him to conclude that various rituals, practices, and manifestations of religion were in fact not derived from any textual source. They were, to him, distortions of religion's initial messages. And his goal was to clarify that a monotheism, as well as a freedom from any religion, lay at the source of all Indian religion. And his last work that was published, 1829, is The Universal Religion, Religious Instructions Founded on Sacred Authorities, about which I can speak in the Q&A if there's interest. This universal religion was eagerly promoted by his friends, the Unitarians of Calcutta. It animates the work of the Brahmo Samaj, a reformist organization begun in the 1820s, 1828. In that year, a trust deed is written. It lays out a set of rules for the members of this reformist group. And by the 1840s, the organization began a journal, Tottoboniri Potrika, 1843, which lasts for 40 years until 1883. And through a process begun by Debendranath Tagore, like Ram Mohan Roy, also an amateur reader of Sanskrit, he began to initiate vows, Debendranath did, and a various structure of initiation into this organization, and also began to craft a broad definition of religion out of ancient Indic sources. And this is seen in a book that is actually a product of a dictation that Debendranath finds himself dictating to one of his colleagues in the 1840s, that is then published as Brahmo Dharma. And this is laying out a definition of religion as a religion of the householder through readings of particular Upanishads, those very same ones read by Roy, and articles of faith as mentioned in the trust deed. After a decade of the appearance of this work during the 1857 mutiny and 58 mutiny rebellions, a young Keshav Chandra Sen stays with Debendranath Tagore in Calcutta, begins to learn about this organization, joins it, and begins to preach for it. For a variety of reasons, he splits from Debendranath, starts a new Brahmo Samaj of India, and begins to publish and cultivate the reading of works of theistic texts from across the world. And in 1869, creates the Brahmo Mandir, built in a new style, aiming to synthesize and mix the religions of India into one new religion. And also in Calcutta, he starts the Bharat Ashram, 1872, an experimental living community where members of this organization would live together, learn about, and have access to the world's traditions. At the end of the 1870s, there was a project undertaken under his supervision to ordain missionaries to study the various religions of India, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Bhakti, Vaishnavism, and also Sikhism was on the table in the beginning, but for various reasons that did not pan out. This was called the New Dispensation, which had apostles, those who had spread out into India, and it was also seen as a science which found, explained, and importantly harmonized all the religions of the world. And so in the time that I have, I'll speak about two people and their projects as these apostles. One, Girish Chandra Sen, was a missionary, deputed to study Islam. 1835 is when he's born and dies in 1910. Born a caste Hindu, converted into this new movement of the Brahmo Samaj in the early 1870s at the time of the rise of Girish Chandra Sen. Of Keshav Chandra Sen. He left a past life filled with caste-based rituals and obligations, confronted a great amount of resistance from his family and his social world, which he'd left in the 1870s to go to Lucknow to study Persian and Arabic as an adult in his 40s. And he immersed himself mostly in the study of tafsir, as well as reading the Quran. Whereas Ram Mohan Roy, a century earlier, had come from the nouveau riche of colonial Calcutta, Girish Chandra Sen grew up in agrarian East Bengal and lived within the vernacular language and traditions of the East. This new vernacular that he came from was cemented into existence primarily through Hindu elite collusion with the East India Company, that of Pandits and other highly placed Hindu Bengalis who had interpreted in the late 18th century Bangla to be a, quote, Hindu language from that point onward. But the era of the rise of Girish Chandra Sen in the middle and late part of the 19th century sees a rising and increasingly literate Muslim small peasant and emergent middle class, and which began to engage with their religion in languages other than Arabic and Persian, and indeed into this new vernacular Bangla. Girish Chandra Sen embarked on a 5-year immersion into the Quran, which he then translated into Persian, into Bangla in the 1870s. And it comes out in the 1880s, from 1881 in serialized fashion. He also translated into Bangla Ram Mohan Roy's Tufatul Mahawaddin, which first came out in 1804. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, he studied with the Maulvi in Lucknow, who taught him Arabic grammar, manners of reading the Quran, and selections from Hafiz. He translates the Quran for the first time in its entirety into vernacular standard Bangla, accessible by everyday people literate in the language. Bits and pieces, of course, had been accessible in Bengali before this, in scattered places, but by 1886, 1,000 copies of Sen's full translation became available, mostly read by Muslim Bengalis, but primarily by Brahmos like Sen himself. He explains to his readers to approach recitations and prayers, and he explains pertinent information about Islam, centering his approach to a non-Muslim readership. And in the preface of the first published version, he lists a set of obligations that Muslims in South Asia would be aware of, facing west while praying, various ritual recitations that would have been common amongst those around him in East Bengal. In Lucknow, he demonstrated a sensibility around the living experience of Islam during that time. He had a variety of sources that he used for his commentary. He read primarily from tafsir that was given to him by his tutor in Lucknow. 3 particular tafsirs, Tafsir Hosseini, Faida, and Jalalain. Tafsir Hosseini was one of the most widely read works in India at the time. He used the Urdu commentary by Shah Abdul Aziz, a son of the heralded Shah Waliullah. He never uses the term Allah in his Quran. He uses terms like Ishwar, Parameshwar, and Odipati. He aims to be true, however, as he writes in various reflections about this project, to the original. And this whole topic, of course, has been covered in a variety of scholarly debates about the role of Islam in Bengal. It has been commented on by scholars such as Tony Stewart and Aisha Irani. For Muslims writing in Bengali, translating concepts from the Banglaphone environment for Muslim readers was, of course, a long tradition. And Sen inputs himself into this tradition. He wrote much else, of course, as well. He wrote a total of 44 books in Bengali about various subjects related to religion, including the nature of God itself. One work, Ishwar Ki Ishwar, is God God? It is a clear dialogue with the history of the Brahmo Samaj itself, in which he remarks upon the origin point of this question coming from Ram Mohan Roy. He pens biographies of the Prophet, as well as other sorts of works. One book is Taposhmala, biographies of Muslim saints translated from the Persian originals. And in the 1880s and 1890s, he writes quite a bit about the Brahmo Samaj itself and the nature of religion and ethics. The last book that he wrote was fittingly titled Natural Religion, which compels attention to Ram Mohan Roy's last book, Universal Religion, his last contribution in 1829. Like his compatriot Girish Chandra Sen, Ogurnath Gupta also hailed from a region outside of the Calcutta metropole, Shantipur, Nodia, above Calcutta, center of older Sanskrit education. He grew up also in a caste Hindu home, lost his father at a young age, and as a young person, also joined the Brahmo Samaj in Calcutta when he was studying at the Hindu college, just as Keshav Chandra Sen was an emergent figure. He met Sen in the late 1850s, and from the 1860s was an active member of the new Brahmo Samaj for India. He joins the movement first as a worker and then as a teacher, preaches and teaches in Dhaka, Rangpur, Moimansingh, Bogora. All of these are regions in what is now Bangladesh. From the 1870s, he joins the Bharat Ashram in Calcutta, mingles with a variety of figures in addition to Keshab, including one Kedarnath Datta, noted Vaishnava theologian, and Bijoy Krishna Goswami, key reader, interpreter of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, as well as Girish Chandra Sen himself and Shivnath Shastri. He is deputed to study Buddhism in 1879 and spends most of that year and 1880 studying Pali, English, and Sanskrit, and his major masterwork is Shakyamuni Charita and Nirbon Tattva. Comes out in 3 volumes later after his death, 1904-1905. It is a detailed study of the life of Siddhartha Gautama in vernacular Bangla. Paralleling in many ways the project of translating the Quran by Shen, both emerge in that decade of the 1880s as elements of the comparative religion wing of the Brahmo Samaj. His interest in Buddhism fit into a wider revival of thought and practice in India about Buddhism at this time. He is, however, a unique figure in this history of Buddhism in India, as there are a variety of forces converging at this time in Bengal about Buddhism. One is the focus on Buddhism in various spaces in northern and eastern Bengal. One, the work of Chakmas, in particular the Queen Kalindi, who invites one venerable monk, Mahastavira, to Rajanagar to revive Buddhism in Chakma country. This is in 1857. And this leads to a large migration of Buddhists who come into that region from the 1860s onward, as well as a consciousness of what is later to be called reformist Buddhism in that region, purged of any heterodox elements. This is happening during the rise of Ogurnath Gupta. Another is the institutional basis for the study of Buddhism, which occurs in the Brahmo Samaj itself. From 1880, the creation of Keshab Chandra Sen's Shakya Shomagam, the area where they would discuss different texts, primarily Buddhist texts, as well as a Buddhist text society, also 1881, that begins in Calcutta. This began after Keshab Chandra Sen had visited Bodh Gaya, and he returns to Calcutta to promote Buddhist texts and sources. Within this broad ambit would be the intellectual labors of Rajendralal Mitra and his work, Sanskrit Buddhist Literature of Nepal, which is the basis of much of Robi Thakur's own plays and stories about Buddhism, which start to emerge later in the early 20th century. As well, we must remember the work of Horiprasad Shastri and his discovery of living Buddhism in Bengal. This emerges in 1897, about a decade after Ogurnath Gupta's work had emerged. Finally, we would have to remember the presence of Anagarika Dharmapala and the Mahabodhi Society, founded in Calcutta 1891, and the presence of Theosophy, which fixates on Buddhism as well. What marks out Ogurnath Gupta in this context is that he is the one who is not an urbane nor urban intellectual supported by a university or a learned society, though his work is interspersed with those institutional forces. He is engaged with various elements outside of the metropole and in the Mofussil regions of East Bengal, and he is aiming to contribute to the new Brahmo religion, not necessarily for the sake of the science of comparative religion, which for Max Muller, of course, relied on the telos of Christianity, but for the service of remaking religion itself in India. Whereas Girish Chandra Sen worked with a Muslim tutor in Lucknow, Ogurnath Gupta, from the available evidence we have, did not work directly with Buddhist monks, though he knew many of them, but primarily with Rajendralal Mitra and his texts and part of his teachings, as well as working with him to understand Pali and Sanskrit. Unlike Dharmapala for Stephen Kemper, in his recent study of the life of Dharmapala, who shows the historical realization of a universalizing mission and movement in the life of Dharmapala, Ogurnath Gupta's Brahmo message was not transformed into a nationalism, as the case for Dharmapala shows. To end quickly here, to return to a point made by many, including Professor Dodson here, is that if we keep the 19th century out of view, there's no way to assess how the changes of that century draw from either continuous intellectual currents or to whose changes do not lie ultimately in forces from the outside. David Chidester, in his Empires of Religion, shows how in another context, African interlocutors in the 19th century were able to use the rising tides of race science and scientific understandings of difference to pursue their own agendas and endeavors. For Indians like Gupta and Sen, in the service of a bigger project to reform religion for the world, they were both deriving parts of their apparatus from pre-1800 knowledge systems, but also deeply invested in the very worlds in which they were living. Following the work of Brian Hatcher and Professor Dodson here on Sanskrit in the 19th century. For the Brahmo Samaj, religion as a discrete object, replete with the possibility of the inclusion of a synthesis of texts and practices of the world. For example, Ogurnath Gupta is a part of this detailed project to collect all of the religious texts of the world into a new textual product, Slok Shongraho. This is something the Brahmo Samaj actively created over the 1880s and 90s, and he is leading that mission. As the scholarship of Abhishek Ghosh and Lucien Wong have shown, the world of bhakti, or devotion, was also included inside of this expanding project of comparative religion. To think of religion in these terms compels an engagement in the history of religions as we know them from European intellectual history, the work of Hans Kippenberg, for example, and the recent work of Robert Yelle. Kippenberg argues that thinkers from Mueller to Tyler and Fraser and various others from the 1850s to the 1930s, in short, the time of the flowering of the Brahmo Samaj, restored to, quote, modern society its other, officially ignored half, the power of life that does not serve progress. While at that time there were many voices in Europe, full-scale scientific approaches that demanded a rejection of religion, historians of comparative religion, for Kippenberg, focused on what was superseded by modernization and conceived of it as a way to recover those practices that were still valid for the present. So social obligations, social bonds, and these sorts of things. If we substitute nationalism in an intellectual history of comparative religion in India for what Kippenberg is claiming for modernization, then perhaps for European thinkers in the age of modernity, what they were exploring outside of the rational, progressive, and the scientific, we will find some common ground in the exploration of options for a variety of purposes. Though formal nationalism emerges in the era of the comparative religion project I have sketched out, the work of Sen and Gupta proceeded according to a mission and a guideline that is not easily captured in terms of nationalism nor modernization. So to return to my title as I end here, about triangulating reform and religion as if they were discrete objects frozen in time, Islam and Buddhism are part and parcel of the reformation of religion in India itself, part of a longer history of thinking about universal and comparative religion, not reducible to histories of institutions or nationalisms alone. To finally build upon the recent work of Robert Yelle and his reflections on how theories of sovereignty would benefit from a revived history of religions approach to questions of violence, normative orders of politics, and disruptions in the modern state. One of the reasons to think about the Brahmo Samaj's comparative religious exercise in the 1880s, at the moment when nationalism is brewing in various ways in India, a deeper history of religions for India may pose alternatives to the variant of religion understood and mobilized in the era of nation-states in which we now live. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Actually, I'll start where Professor Neeta Kumar ended. She was talking about the role of Indian intelligentsia, especially the English-educated one, but I'll take my paper. Through my paper, I would like to speak about the intellectuals of 19th century about whom we don't have much information, and I'll be citing 3 case studies, one of Maulana Abdul Latif, second Haji Muhammad Mohsin, and third obviously is a text which talks about the informal practices in the field of history of education. This paper aims to analyze the relationship between forms of knowledge and intellectual traditions in South Asia, more specifically India, and the role and use of intellectual traditions in the field of history of education. It would explore the following questions. What is knowledge, as was rightly described by Professor Neeta Kumar, and what is it for? How do historians, and in particular historians of education, construe and use intellectual traditions? And how do they respond to theoretical problems of intellectual interactions? The paper intends to pose these questions in light of ongoing discussions in the field of history of education regarding the role, relevance, and utility of knowledge traditions in historical research, analysis, and narratives. The paper plans to utilize the ongoing scholarly exchanges as a case study of how some historians respond to theoretically informed works under the lenses reading with insistences for distance and beyond, and to understand the responses on what Foucault and the theory on post-structuralism. Perhaps the finest contributions of this paper would like to locate South Asian intellectual history, especially the Indian intellectual history, and tradition within global conversations in order to illustrate the knowledge like people, moved, and is fluid. The paper seeks to look into some of the relevant yet unearthed themes like whether cultural interactions in the realm of knowledge production, early Orientalists learning from Pandits, Maulvis, scholars of Jainism, Buddhism, and Sufism, but what these indigenous occupants have learned from them during the first interaction with the outside world. Colonial government made inroads into the Indian socio-cultural structures with the help of early educated Indians, who were also the promoters of Western knowledge and used the then existing pre-colonial administrative cultural structure, as rightly being cited many times by Professor Chris Bailey in his work on the 19th century. The paper would also try to look into the aspect of whether the cultural interaction in the realm of knowledge production and further to concept of identity formation of the students of different institutions, the relation with the lineage of scholars in terms of sectarian boundaries, with the professionalization of traditional scholarship of Pandits and Maulvis and other intellectuals of different religion, the different nomenclatures for different teachers, munshis and scholars has changed to remain intact with the growth of British colonialism in India. It has already been approved that the intellectuals has a significant role to play in bringing about social change. Their action will be directed by the aspirations of class to which they belong. They were expected to play a counter-hegemonic role in society to evolve new patterns. This necessitates an ideological conquest of the traditional intellectuals to establish the hegemony of the group they represent. One of the limitations of Indian intellectuals of the 19th century was their incomprehension of the fact that European domination was having an intellectual tradition of at least 1,000 years to its credit. They noticed only the material genealogy of the modern Western thought through the agency of England. They formulated their sensibility in the dichotomous relation of inner and outer as observed by Parth Chatterjee. Anti-colonial nationalism in Asia and Africa created its own domain of sovereignty within colonial society well before its political battle with the imperial power. This is done by dividing the world of social institutions and practices into two domains, the material, which is outer, and the spiritual, which is inner. The economy and statecraft of science and technology belonged to the external domain, where the West had proved its superiority and the East had succumbed. The spiritual, on the other hand, is an inner domain bearing the essential marks of cultural identity. To retain the identity of Indian culture, it is essential to make it powerful enough to be able to overpower the hegemonic authority of outer world. Hence, the option happened to be that of building up a materially powerful modern India. So they believed that Indian institutions were to be transformed in accordance with the current European ideas. They did not verify the internal processes that gave hegemony to Europe before they venture on reforming Indian institutions and practices. It has also been admitted that opportunities to understand such processes were also limited. The new education, which is English education, that was introduced in India did not attach importance to imparting such age. Macaulay has a different perspective which extended the interest of colonialism. Hence, the colonial power assumed an ideological dimensions as the representative of progress in their thoughts. Moreover, the features of educated intelligentsia included a dependence upon the British Raj, considering themselves as a part of establishment and looking up to the British for protection and promotion. Passion for English education and Western knowledge penetrated even the obscure and remote regions of Bengal during this British period. Now I'll be citing three case studies. First one, obviously, of Nawab Abdul Latif Khan Bahadur, 1828 to 1893. He was CIE officer also. Nawab Abdul Latif, a prominent Muslim intellectual of 19th century Bengal, was devoted to the cause of Muslim education and consciousness. Was born in 1828 to a respectable Muslim family of eastern Bengal. He believed that modern education was a precondition to the growth of Muslim consciousness, and he tried his best to create facilities for the Muslims of Bengal to equip themselves with modern education introduced by the British government. A public servant all through his life, he preached his mission through constitutional means, despite heavy official preoccupations such as the Deputy Magistrate in Bengal Provincial Service, Fellow of Calcutta University, Member of Bengal Legislative Council twice in 1860 and 1870, an Honorary Magistrate, and the founder of Presidency College and the Calcutta Literary Society. His contribution to the cause of Muslim education and of their advancement was so great that W. William Hunter called him the most distinguished Muslim reformer of the day, and Sir Richard Temple wrote about him as the most progressive and enlightenment among the Muslims of Bengal. Abdul Latif, along with his two brothers, was educated at the Calcutta Madrasa, which was one of the earliest institutions established by Britishers in 1780-1781, which had a center of Persian Arabic studies. It was in the Madrasa itself that he was first brought face to face with the problem, which was to form the chief work of his life. The Muslim community, clinging to old traditional forms of study, turned a deaf ear to the rising tide of modernism in the name of English education, and the same was introduced when he was a student of Calcutta Madrasa. In vain, it was pointed out to them that under the new colonial regime, knowledge of English was essential, and the study of Persian and Arabic was considered as Islamic law was not important, and it was believed to be. It was only the Muslims like the Abdul Latif and some other fellow students who had a true insight into the future and threw themselves heartily into the study of English. The introduction of study of English into the curriculum had been watched with great interest by the colonial government, which had used every means in its power to bring necessity of its plainly before the eyes of Muslim community. Another service he rendered to the community was to call public attention to the administration of Mohsin Fund. Mohsin Fund was established by Haji Muhammad Mohsin to promote the Muslim education, and also English was one of the important subjects in Hooghly Madrasa and Calcutta Madrasa. He pointed out that the Muslims were not deriving their advantage from a fund founded by Haji Muhammad Mohsin, as I told, especially in comparison to the Hindus who were benefiting from it to a far greater extent. Abdul Latif's early proficiency in English, a rare distinction in those days for a Muslim, brought him into contact with many of the highest government officials of that period. The few students who were prompt to take advantage of the English classes in Calcutta Madrasa were generally marked out for encouragement and distinction, and Abdul Latif, who was a leading Muslim student of the Madrasa, had won a government scholarship. He soon found a place in the best society of the day. In those days, very few government posts were open to Indian students, and Abdul Latif also waited for some time before he could get an appointment under the government. After leaving the Madrasa, he first joined as private secretary to the Amir of Sindh, who was residing on a political pension at Dum. The next year, he was officiating as a master at the Decca Collegiate School. After another temporary assignment with a commission of inquiry under under Samuels, the ICS officer, he was back to the Calcutta Madrasa as an Anglo-Arabic professor. He, however, did not have to wait for long at the Madrasa. In 1849, at the age of 21, he was appointed a deputy magistrate by Sir Herbert Maddock, deputy governor of Bengal, on a pay of rupees 200 per month, and was posted to the headquarters station of 24 Parganas. In 1853, Abdul Latif, with the sanction of Council of Education, offered a prize of 100 for the best Persian essay on the advantages of English education in Mohammedan students. The announcement was published in a notification of Calcutta Gazette of 10th August 1853. The competition was open to all the students of Muslim persuasion throughout India. The Nawab writes, "My chief object in offering this prize was to invite to the students the attention of those of Muslim community throughout the country who had not even given a thought to the question of imparting even English education to their children, apparently are beyond discussion and elicit their opinion upon it," unquote. The time for the competition was limited to 5 months, but later extended, and to give more time to the Muslim thinkers. The result was more than expected, that Muslim writers of all over India evinced keen interest in the competition. Many Muslim scholars from Punjab, Awadh, northwestern provinces, Bengal, Bihar and Bombay sent in their essays for education. While some of the essays wrote strongly against giving Muslim education to Mohammedan children, quoting scriptures for their purpose, and even denounced the giver of the prize as an enemy and revolutionizer of Islam, others took more favorable view of the question, unquote. A committee of experts examined the essays. An essay of Maulvi Abdul Fattah Ali Elias Ashraf Ali, Arabic and Persian lecturer of Sir Jamshedji Jiji Bhoi, Benevolent Institution of Bombay, was adjudged the best, and prize went to him. In 1870, the lower classes of Muslim community were again thrown into a state of excitement by the conduct and preachings of Wahhabis, who were rapidly becoming a serious thorn in the side of colonial government. Abdul Latif was quick to see the harm that they might do and regressive nature of their teaching, which was opposed to all theories of progress and modern advancement, and thus he took steps to counteract their influence. He invited Maulvi Karamat Ali of Jaunpur, who was one of the celebrated religious scholars of 19th century and an exponent of law on the duty of Muslims in colonial India towards the ruling power. Karamat Ali had graced the occasion with a lecture on the same subject at the Mohammedan Literary Society on 23rd November 1870, showing clearly from the classical works of Islamic jurisprudence and on colonial India, and cited that colonial India was Darul Islam, and it would be unlawful and irreligious for Muslims to preach a jihad against it as the ruling power. Not only was this address was fully approved by the leading Muslims of India, it also received approbation of the muftis of Mecca, who were consulted on the subject. It is with this background in mind that we have to judge the works of Nawab Abdul Latif. His task was very difficult and onerous. He set before himself two principles. One, to encourage the Muslims to receive modern education through the medium of English and to create facilities for them to do so. And second, to keep the Muslims loyal to the English rulers. The Bengali Gazette wrote about him on 10 January 1885. I'm quoting from that. He has ever been a faithful representative of the Muslims of Bengal, and above all, he has been their great pioneer in the cause of English education. His labors in the case of education will be lovingly remembered by his countrymen and will crown his name and his memory with lasting honor, unquote. One of the causes why the Muslims were not attracted to English education was that they did not like to give up their traditional culture and education in Arabic and Persian. The Muslim looked upon the Sanskritized Bengali taught in the schools by Sanskrit Pandits with disfavor. On this question, W. Hunter writes, I'm quoting him, the truth is that our system of public instructions ignored the three most powerful instincts of the Mussalman heart. And in the first place, it conducts education in the vernaculars of Bengal and a language that the educated Mohammedan despise, that by means of Hindu teachers, whom the whole Mohammedan community hates. In the second place, our rural school seldom enable a Mohammedan to learn the tongues necessary for their holding respectable positions in life and for the performance of his religious duties. Every Mohammedan gentleman must have some knowledge of Persian, and Persian is a language unknown even in our higher class district schools. Even Mussalmans, from the peasant to the prince, ought to say his prayers in one of the sacred languages, Persian or Arabic, and our schools have never recognized. In the third place, our system of public instruction makes no provision for religious education of Mohammedan youth. A system of purely secular education is certainly altogether unsuited to the illiterate and fanatical peasantry of Mohammedans of Bengal, unquote. Nawab Abdul Latif held the same view. He said, I'm quoting him, the ordinary Bengali school was unsuited to the requirements of Mohammedan peasantry. There is too much of Hindu influence. The guru in almost all cases is a Hindu. So are many of the pupils, and there is not much of sympathy between them on the one hand and Mohammedan pupils in the other. He suggested that the language of school in which Muslim boys might be able to study must be a mean between highly Sanskritized Bengali language of Hindu schools on the one hand and the Muslim Bengali on the other, which was thickly intermingled with the Persian and Arabic terms, unquote. Nawab Abdul Latif read a paper on Muslim education in Bengal at the second session of Bengal Social Science Association held at Town Hall of the Calcutta on 30th January 1868, in which he discussed the history of Calcutta Madrasa since its inception. He discusses at length the mismanagement of Madrasa, the introduction of an English class and its failure, and the attempt to get English book translated into Arabic and failure of project and ultimately the establishment of Anglo-Persian department in the Calcutta Madrasa in 1854. In conclusion, the Nawab suggested the elevation of Anglo-Persian department of the Calcutta Madrasa on the status of the college. The Nawab claims that it was due to his pleading that the Presidency College was established. Reporting on the laying of the foundation stone of Presidency College on 27 February 1873, a Calcutta daily wrote as follows, I am quoting, the Maulvi Abdul Latif Khan Bahadur said that His Honor the Lieutenant Governor had done him a great honor by asking him to speak a word or two on this important occasion. He very gladly compiled his honor request, and because the formal laying down of foundation stone of the Presidency College of Calcutta by His Excellency was an event which was peculiarly gratifying to him for a twofold reason. First, because the Presidency College had been created chiefly with a view to provide an institution for imparting a higher standard of English education to his co-religionists and the Mohammedan community of Calcutta, and secondly, because he, Maulvi Abdul Latif, had taken some part, however insignificant and humble it may be, in bringing the creation of this Presidency College. He here begged to be pardoned for explaining himself on these points, unquote. In 1863, Abdul Latif founded the Mohammedan Literary Society in Calcutta, which was one of the important centers for Muslims to have interaction on different issues related to that religion. The foundation of the society was yet another landmark in the Nawab's attempt to educate his co-religionists. I'm quoting him, he conceived the idea of arousing the Mohammedan community into literary activity and public spirit by establishing a society where Mohammedans might meet for intellectual enlightenment and social intercourses, unquote. Its object was also to break prejudice and exclusiveness and to interest its members in present-day politics and modern thought and learning. Regular meetings were held and papers were read and discussed at the Mohammedan Education Society. The second important personality of 19th century about whom we don't have many written evidences is Haji Muhammad Mohsin, 1730 to 1812. He was one of the important intellectuals of 18th and 19th century. He was born in 1730 and he was 8 years younger than his sister Manu Jahan Khanum. He was one of the greatest Muslims of 18th and 19th century and well known for his learning, piety, philanthropy, and especially for his 100 years trust that he left behind. This kept his memories alive and conferring immensely benefited on the succeeding generations. His main contribution was to organize a fund in the name of himself, which was left behind by his sister, called Haji Muhammad Mohsin Fund, which was responsible for funding, giving funds to different madrasas of late 18th and early 19th century. The third important personality about I'm very much interested in talking about Lal Bihari Dey. He has written his autobiography, which is published in a book form and presents his vivid and realistic pictures of life over a century and a half. Although this may fade slightly from the memory of readers, it cannot disappear completely. Dey converted to Christianity on 2nd July 1843. He began his career as a catechist in the new church found by Duff and further worked as a preacher at Ambika Kalna, Bardhaman district of Bengal. He also wrote the famous work called Folk Tales of Bengal, which is a collection of his interaction and discussions in villages and bazaars, and he has related these to various legendary tales for about 2 decades. He served as a successful teacher of Berhampur School and then at Hooghly College. He retired in 1887 and died on 28 October 1994. One of the important works of Lal Bihari Dey, which I found very fascinating during my archival work at British Library, called it's Bengal peasant's life, called Gobind Sahamanta. Gobind Sahamanta basically is a comprehensive pictures of peasant's life of Bengal of the time and concrete evidence of how social customs and religious taboos caused hindrance to the participation of weaker sections in the educational process. Lal Bihari Dey's work talks about a village called Kanchanpur in the Bardhaman districts, and he talks about two pathshalas of that Bardhaman districts, one run by a poor Kayastha teacher called Ramrup and the other by a Brahmin Pandit. Usually people from indigenous classes send their boys to Ramrup's pathshala, while the upper class and caste peoples would send their sons to the other pathshala of the Brahmin teacher. Dey's work, Gobind Sahamanta, written in 1871, published in 1874, placed him as one of the respectable writers of fiction in the English language. In the same novel, they talked about his experience of education system at the village level, which he described as a character called Gobind in his education at the initial stages, which was as follows. The day on which Gobind was, for the first time, was taken to a pathshala was an important day to the family as well as to the hero himself. This is a very fascinating story about Gobind. Though unlike the middle and higher classes who seldom send a child to school for the first time without performing some religious ceremonies, the poorer classes ask not to ministration of Brahmin, yet the matter is regarded with the liveliest interest. Even since his birth, Gobind has not had a stitch of clothing on his person. Though more than 5 years old, he was allowed to revel in the unrestrained freedom of primal nudity. It was on the morning of that important day that his grandmother wrapped round his waist in fold and with the dhoti, which is a traditional Indian attire, which I have spoken, leaving the rest of the body, which was nearly the whole quite naked. Thus dressed on white, on little man's bowed down to the ground before his grandmother, his mother, his father, uncle, aunt, relatives, all took keen interest in sending him to the school. And before going to school, his father, formed a ritual, and that ritual, Gobind was supposed to speak and repeat 3 times, called Sri Hari, Sri Hari, Sri Hari, and left the house for the pathshala. Further, Lal Bihari Dey in Gobind Sahamanta also gives a description of village pathshala and schoolmaster, talking about how the Kayasthas, the school pathshala run by a Kayast teacher, it was one of the important centers of learning because it imparted education in skill thing, basically art of accountancy, learning arithmetic, bahi khata, and that was related to the job creation thing. But because of the Brahminical domination of society, most of the people from upper class and upper caste send their children to the Brahmin's pathshala, because Brahmin pathshalas were supposed to impart knowledge in Sanskrit language and literature. So this is a very important study of Lal Bihari Dey, especially Gobind Sahamanta, and he talks in detail about the performance, the rituals, the cultural interaction, the social interaction, and how Gobind graduated from that, first to the Brahmin school, then he came back from Brahman's pathshala, and further his father sent him to the Kayastha school because he belonged to the Zamindari family, and his father wanted his son to learn the art of, account making and account keeping so that he could run his Zamindari properly. So it's a long paper, I think Michael is suggesting me to bind up. Anyone can read this Gobind Sahamanta work. It's very fascinating and interesting. So to conclude my paper, I would like to say that these are the typical examples of structural and attitudinal hindrance to the mass education in hierarchical society. Before we conclude this part of our discussion, we require dealing with yet another question, the question of motivation. The question again can be posed in a different way. And what is called why education. In a hierarchical society, education no doubts conveys different meaning to different strata of people, and the zamindars and their associates consider education as their exclusive right and privileges. They require some education to maintain their superior position in the society for running the exploitative machinery. They patronized higher education, higher learning, as it was necessary for the maintenance of social structure to bring up a learned leisure section that would legitimize their privileged position on the one hand and persuade the lower caste to accept servitude on the other. The Rayyats, however, needed the rudimentary knowledge of writing and accounts to guard their rights in land against the tyranny of zamindars and for the management of their property as well. The artisans and traders also needed some education for keeping accounts. The only class which could not find any purpose in educating their children was neither the laborers, since they had no property to keep guard over, nor any avenues for the betterment of their condition through education. The class interests of zamindars and rayyats being diametrically opposed, their respective motives for education and also was different. At the same time, there were also an understanding of insufficiencies of such education. Some of them demanded the inclusion of more scientific and medical subjects in curriculum, and such constraints and contradictions expressed in thought of 19th century intellectuals were studied thoroughly. It is also to be noted that there were some intellectuals who developed a different perspective from educational system, but their voice was submerged in the clamor of Europeanization, as it offered opportunities of employment under the British to the newly educated Indians. Personal improvement restricted them for perceiving the true nature of education, and the British Raj, such situation emerged as the people engaged in this activity came from educated classes who cut themselves off from the traditional intellectual society. Those who had the privilege of getting exposed to colonial education were undergoing an intellectual crisis. Thank you so much. Yeah, next 5-7 minutes. 5-7 minutes.
We're going to forego lunch for 5 minutes and open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much for pointing out this important aspect of Karamat Ali. And Karamat Ali, in his lecture at Calcutta, has rightly been advocating the education of Muslims also. But he was the pioneer, as you said, in the female education, to promote female education in the field of larger sections of Muslim society. Raja Ram Mohan Roy I have not cited just because Raja Ram Mohan Roy's contribution to the English education is very well known, about his letter to the then Governor General asking him why to open a Sanskrit college in 1817 rather to have an institution based on the European ideals, and where English shall be one of the important one of the important languages. And further, 1823, we see the establishment of Sanskrit College, and 1817, Hindu College was established. So, and yet, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who graduated from Calcutta Madrasa during his early age, he was well versed in different languages, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, and also Sanskrit. He was one of the important persons before Machiavelli to talk about first English education in 1817, and second, he was one of the important advocates of vernacular languages and literature. And he said that we need to promote both kind of institutions, one which was based on the vernacular language and literature and which would cater to the larger masses of society. And second, we need to understand the proper nuances of colonialism. We need to know the language of the West, which is English. So he in a way was the first in Indian intelligentsia, educated in different sections called vernacular as well as English, to talk about the importance of both the set of practices, formal as well as informal education.
Thank you for a very detailed set of questions. I'll be very quick. Just yes on the compromise part. The compromise of the type of bhakti that emerges during the rise of Keshav Chandra Sen. Oganath Gupta is a part of the let's say, Keshav Chandra Sen world. He's very close to Kedarnath Dutta and Bhakti Vinod Thakur, and he doesn't, in a way, stick to the body. And this is all detailed in a set of debates between Bhakti Vinod and Keshav Chandra Sen. Part of the goal is to bring out Oganath Gupta's role, which has been under researched of this moment.
So I've been told that it's time for lunch. Thank you to both the speakers and thank you to the audience. And we will reconvene at 2 o'clock, please.
Lunch is at downstairs.